Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another one of the MFA Fine Arts talks. So tonight, I'm going to introduce the fellow who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. So Christian Ratemeyer, who's sitting over there in the front row, is a curator and arts executive, arts cultural entrepreneur, arts organizer, whom I met in 2012, 2014, in Zagreb, Croatia, where I was installing a show. And this guy walks in and introduces himself, and a really nice conversation ensued. He was then associate curator of drawings and prints at the Museum of Modern Art. And I was impressed that, he was really doing his legwork, researching, modern and contemporary art, I guess most of modern art in Eastern Europe. Fast forward to about 2 years ago, maybe, I got an email from someone. It really caught my eye. It was announcing a sort of like a save the date for an opening at a gallery called Osmos Address over in the East Village. And I just really liked the way it was written. And I read it kind of closely, and I noticed that the artist mentioned that they had a barn studio in Stamford, New York. I have a bit of a connection to Stamford, so I showed up at the opening, and there was Christian and his partner in running the gallery, Kay Sophie Rabinowitz. So turns out that Christian and his partner, Kay Sophie, run a gallery in the Lower East Side, a gallery up in Stamford, New York, up in the Catskills, and a magazine called Osmos. They now live up there full-time. Christian went from being a curator at MoMA. Before that, he was curator at Artist Space, one of the longest running and most highly esteemed nonprofit art spaces in New York City. He briefly served as director of Sculpture Center in Long Island City. Long ago, he worked on several documentas in Germany, and he's taught at Hunter and at Bard Center for Curatorial Studies. So all in all, a really interesting person to know. I've been following their exhibitions both in Stamford and here, where Felipe has a show opening Thursday night. Tomorrow night, thank you. So I'm sure I'll see you guys all there. It'll be jam-packed. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our introducer, Christian Ratemeyer.
Thank you, Mark. You make me blush. I have a funny role here today because introducing Felipe, usually when situations like this ensue, I'm the one who's inviting the artist and introduce. And in this instance, I was the one who introduced Mark and Felipe to each other. And so Mark very kindly invited me to become the sort of interlocutor and introducer of Felipe's work. Felipe is an artist who I met when I was director at Sculpture Center, so only about 3-4 years ago. We chatted mostly sort of outside of opening events and dinners and so on, and had wonderful conversations right away. And then it turned out that Felipe mentioned Osmos, the exhibition space gallery that my wife and I run on East First Street in the East Village, and confessed that he'd been to pretty much every single show we've had there, and that it was one of his kind of go-to places because it's small and weird, and mostly the shows are a little kind of, to the side, so to speak. And out of that, a kind of conversation ensued. And basically since COVID, really, we've been mostly upstate, as Mark mentioned, and turned a very kind of informal gallery, garage, studio space into a slightly more formal endeavor. And as of end of last year, we turned it into a proper nonprofit. So we have now an artist residency program upstate called Arts and Rec, which occupies the same space as Osma Station, which is the name that the exhibition venue, kind of residency venue, previously had. And we invited Felipe about a year and a half, 2 years ago to consider coming up and doing something. It really came about when Felipe had a solo show at the Paris Museum in Miami 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
2001, yes. 2 years ago.
21, yeah. And one of the things that struck us as interesting is the way that you come into an environment and try to engage with local collaborators to produce work that in many ways sits sort of very much within a dialogue with high modernism, but then also engages kind of different craft traditions and different local traditions. And so out of these conversations came a suggestion that Felipe made, that he was interested in a kind of Northeastern quilting tradition. And so you came in March of last year for the first time in the dead of winter, which is quite impressive, and began sort of a longer search and conversation for collaborators. You returned back in the summer for 3 weeks, and then this year, February, March, you came for 5-6 weeks to Stamford, New York, and worked with a local quilter named Danielle Tucker, and developed a series of 11 new works over the course of 6 weeks that we then had an exhibition with in upstate New York. And 10 of the 11 works are premiering here in New York tomorrow night, 6 to 8, 50 East First Street at Osmos, which I'm very happy and proud to be able to present in the city. You just told me that it's your first solo show in New York, which is kind of unbelievable because you've lived here for 25 years, but you've shown internationally everywhere from the Sao Paulo Biennial to the Perez Museum to the Museum El Eco, with your galleries in Switzerland. You have an upcoming show in Belgium. So you've been very, very widely exhibited and presented everywhere except your adopted hometown of New York. So we're glad that we could change that. I don't want to talk too much about your work because you're going to do that. All that is to say that in the few years that we began our conversations outside of a
Bar?
exactly a bar in Long Island City after a sculpture center opening, I'm very, very proud and pleased to have been able to play a role in the development of a new body of work. And yeah, can't wait to hear you put it all in perspective with your practice and your previous works.
Well,
Felipe, it's all yours.
Thank
you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Mark, for the invitation. Thank you, Kristen, for we're all blushing today, I guess. But yeah, it's true. I've been in New York for 23 years, and this is my first solo show in the city. So it's kind of an important step for me, and I appreciate the support of Kay Sophie and Christian, because also it was something that developed, as he said, over time. But okay, to start now, I come from Chile, which this is a photo of Santiago. I studied there in the 90s, right after a dark period of the history of Chile, which is the dictatorship, the civil military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, led by Augusto Pinochet. So the 90s was a very, we recovered the democracy in 89, there was a referendum, and then in 1990, there was the first democratic election since 1970. So it was a very intense and interesting period, economically, socially, culturally, the country was sort of waking up, and there was a lot of energy, and this is the time when I kind of by accident, a lot of things have happened to me a little bit by accident, but kind of by accident, I finished in art school. I was trying to study architecture. In those days, you had to have a very high score in math, like the equivalent of the SAT's math score. I don't know why. I've spoken about this with architects. They also don't understand why. But at the end, you'll see my work is very architectural too. So it's not that I completely changed my like teenage expectations. So this is Santiago. We're right next to the mountains, to the Andes, which are this beautiful mountain chain. It only looks like this when it rains. When it doesn't rain, it's pretty much gray and polluted. Oh. Okay, there. So I'm gonna do a little sort of first introduction because the work I do is very influenced by collaboration. Again, in the art school I went to, and this is specific context of Chile in the 90s. It's very different from New York, and even very different from the sort of the history in terms of infrastructure and institutions and collections that you can find, for example, in Buenos Aires or in Sao Paulo or in Mexico City. Chile is much less developed in that sense. We didn't have many opportunities. There's almost no market for contemporary art. So with a group of friends, we opened up an artist-run space called Galeria Chilena. It was a nomadic artist-run space. And even in art school, I collaborated a lot. And so you'll see also through the sort of the history I'm going to tell now about how I came up with this textile work, which I call curtains. Collaboration is also very present. I think it's basically because that's the way I became, or sort of discovered, that I wanted to be an artist when I was, in my 20s or early 20s. So this is the first curtain that I produced for an exhibition in Chile in 2006. It also kind of happened as an accident. I was in that time exploring some video work. I already lived in New York, but only for a few years. So this is 2006. I moved here in 2000, and to show the videos in this space, I needed to obscure the room, and I felt and decided that to put a black curtain was too boring. It was like, I'm just playing around, fooling around with video. I think it's very important that as artists, we always experiment. When we lose that sort of defensiveness of making mistakes. You can try a video. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But out of this video project came out the curtain, the first curtain, which I decided to do a geometric, abstract curtain, which has a split in the center, and you could walk in and then you see the videos inside. So this is the first one, and what immediately kind of struck me was the economy of means, and also the conceptual economy of the material, that it's very simple to produce. For example, for this one, I hired a seamstress who I knew from before. She used to live close to my mother. She still lives close to where my mother used to live, in Santiago. And I bought the fabric, I cut the shades, and then she helped me, put it together. She made it in her home. It's not something that you need a huge studio. And basically that's also why I call the works curtains, because I'm trying to sort of have a starting point of a discussion about them from a domestic point of view, from a point of view that I don't know how much is it present here, but at least in Latin America, or where I come from, people still fix clothes and maybe make even clothes and knit and embroider, and there's a tradition of sort of this domestic textile production. So that's why I used to call them curtains, because I want to focus sort of initiate the conversation from that point of view. So this was the first one. And then, as I mentioned, I was also involved with this group of friends. We had an artist-run space. So the first one served sort of as a sort of a border, or sort of this permeable door or window, or however you want to call it, between the interior and the exterior of the gallery space. And then I kept on installing in different places. I'm not going to show everything, of course. I'm going to skip to the most important. Soon I discovered that they can also behave as architecture, so they could also build space, temporal spaces within a space. In this case, I was invited to a group show in Vienna, but also as Galeria Chilena and Felipe Mujica as an artist. So I basically did a combination of both, of the textile work with documentation and images of the artist run space in Chile, which was alive, sort of to say, that existed from 97 to 2000, which is when I moved to New York. So here, the curtains basically don't have a design, they're just, plain colors, but they serve as a space to hold other artworks from other artists, which is also something that interests me, like how they can also become functional elements. My interest in geometric abstraction comes from kind of a split situation where on the one hand, in the art school where I studied, you could choose a mention like painting, printmaking, drawing, etc. And I work with printmaking, and within printmaking, I was very interested in the process of printmaking and in the system of how you can develop a system, craft a system, and then also play with the system and change it and adapt it to your interest. And then the second sort of side of the story is that, of course, we have a very strong tradition of geometric abstraction in Latin America, both from art history point of view, and also in the textiles of indigenous people, of pre-Hispanic people in Peru, in Bolivia. Of course, it has a different meaning, but there is a use of geometric abstraction in their textiles and in their, ceramics and pottery and so on. And normally when I start a project, it always begins as a very formal exercise. In this case, I will choose a background and a shape, always starting with a grid, and I will play with that grid, and I will try to come up with variations of that same grid. And then there was a step, that I had to find the fabric, similar color, similar, and basically produce a piece of fabric. So there's a transition from here to here, which I also, I kind of phrase it in, like, if I had, like, in one sentence, which is, I was always interested in expanding the formal to the social. And in this expansion, the first gesture is the use of space and how the viewer and the public interacts with space and with the piece. In this case, this was a gallery show, which I think is the only gallery show I have here in the slide selection. But for me, it was also an important step in the sort of the evolution of the curtains, because I was also, with every show, I would learn something from them. Like, I'm interested in learning from the work more than being super sure, like, oh, this is going to happen, and 1 + 2 is 3. No, I kind of learn in studying the work, seeing how it reacts with space, how it behaves with space. And in this case, for example, here, the curtain actually became a curtain. It's against the window. On the wall, it behaves as a sort of as a painting, or uses a space of a painting. And then against this door, or this space here, there's between one room and the other, it also behaves as a sliding door. Each curtain is hanging on a cable, so also the public is invited to move them. The position is not fixed, and that's another level of making the work expand from the formal to the social, involving the public. This is another example. Also, again, the design, which this is sort of like the first phase where I will make these collages or drawings and then find the fabric and then find a producer that will work with me producing the work, or, sewing basically the work. So this piece here, it's for an outdoor piece, and it's designed as, so the public can basically move the pieces around, and it's not very tall, like each one was about 2 meters. So, you know, reaching your hand up high, you can still slide the top row. This is for a show in Ecuador where here there's also like a new sort of direction or step, because the designs for these drawings, for these curtains, were not fixed. I kind of call them open designs. It's just one color against a black, sorry, a white, you know, just a notebook, whatever the background is. And then the color combinations were decided with the fabricators. This is something, this was sort of a new step in a way to open up the work even more, that sometimes I invite the fabricators to also take decisions. In this case, how the, you know, this bright color with what background it's paired with, and so on. The curators of the show also proposed me to hang the pieces around and in dialogue with the space and with different artworks. And also as a background for this room, which was part of a project of another artist called Marinella Senatore, who's an Italian artist, and she works mostly with choreography and performance and dance. And she was, the exhibition was actually in a school, in a high school. This is in Ecuador, in Cuenca. And she did a workshop, a dance and choreography workshop with the students. So it was sort of also, you know, in dialogue with this project of Marinella. The fabric that you see here, the very bright fabric, comes from this, which is the dress of a chola, which is a mestizo indigenous woman from the Andes. And this was a suggestion of one of the curators to use this fabric, these bright colors that are very, you know, from that context, from that place, from Ecuador. So just to make it, you know, just to make the work have something, also a dialogue with this local use of color. That's an example of the drawing that I was saying that is not complete. It's sort of incomplete, and then it completes itself when the work is being produced, you know. And in this case, I work with Lucy and Laura. They were part of a sort of a family-run textile operation in Cuenca, you know, family-run business. This is that previous exhibition was 2014. This one here is 2016. It's for the Bienal de Sao Paulo, which was a very, of course, big deal for me. And I think so far it might be the largest project I've done. We produced 30 curtains, pretty large in size too. They're about 10 feet high by like 5 feet wide. And I was invited to meet different textile studios in Sao Paulo. So I did a first research trip in January 2016, and there I met this couple here, the two friends, Alex and Valentina. They are designers, artists, and work with textiles, and they were part of also of a larger sort of community of artists and architects that they all sort of share this office/studio space. So I proposed to do 15 with them, and then 15 with another group of women who focus on embroidery, and they created a cooperative of embroiderers, and this is in the outskirts of Sao Paulo, also in a different kind of neighborhood, you know, that for very completely different socioeconomic reality. These women were mostly, you know, they created this cooperative with the help of Renato Ambriosi, who's a sort of an expert in Brazilian handcraft and textile traditions and craft traditions. And he basically works around all of Brazil, helping and developing these communities where he does research on a specific technique of that region or maybe a material, and then teaches this to the people or finds people who know it, and then they develop a group, you know, and it's a way to also create an economy, a local economy, you know, a job basically. And yeah, and so it's a very sort of tight group of women who, you know, they're basically embroiderers and that's their job. And it's also something that they can do. They share a studio, but they can also do it at home while watching a novela, you know, or soap opera, or being with their family or anything. So I work with the group in total is about 40 to 50 women, but the ones that I work with like 10, 15 for about a month. And they also taught me how to embroider. And I will share with them, go with them, you know, spend almost all day for almost 3 to 4 weeks, and yeah, and produce the work together. Here also you can see the drawings or the sort of the designs laying on the fabric, and that's what I call open design, because then it's the color combinations were decided by the fabricators. This is sort of just a snapshot of the neighborhood, which I think their studio is here on the left. And that's how it looked installed. You know, the ones that are solid are mostly fabric on fabric, and the ones that are linear, the lines are embroidered. Again, here, the bottom row, the public was invited to move them, to slide them around, to play with different combinations. This is so it was 15 on the first floor and then 15 spread in the rest of the building. So this is one workshop space where they also do talks and different events. There was even a kitchen there, or 2 kitchens. And so this is meant to sort of create this situation where you can open up the space or close it for two different events. So again, the work is, it has this playful sort of character where people can move it, interact with it, and also functional. It can divide space, organize space. And all this with, of course, the background of geometric abstraction, which is something that I sometimes I forget to mention, because for me it's very obvious, but you know, for example, I come from Chile, and in Chile in the 80s, with the dictatorship, there's this like strong group of artists called La Escena Avanzada, and it was a very like political and conceptual, like hardcore kind of work. And so in Chile, we have this sort of, there's a tradition of accusing artists of being too formal, like, oh no, your work is too formal, like it's not political enough, it's not socially engaged enough. And for me, the contrary. For me, the history of abstraction is a history of social compromise, or at least social awareness, and trying to, through this kind of work, trying to create either, you know, you have all these from the Russians to the Bauhaus to all these different schools, where geometric abstraction, and it's also, it's sort of yeah, sort of how do you say, where it, you know, it's ideal, or it's sort of dream of becoming, you know, the total artwork, where you can have something that a piece that's art, is also design, it's architecture, it's this complete piece that's hard to define like one way, which is also the way I see these works. Like they are textiles, they're also drawings, they're also sort of color field studies, they're interactive, they have different layers and different ways to approach it. They have a sort of a far vision or sort of approach where it's in dialogue with space and architecture. And then the closer you get, you start seeing the stitches and the texture of the fabric, all these details that for me also sort of are equivalent to a painter. When a painter decides what brush to use, or how thick the paint is, or how transparent the paint is, for me, the fabric has that same kind of, or at least for me as an artist, of choices. Like, you know, some fabrics that I've used are more transparent. You can actually see behind it, like the first photo that I showed, and some are more grainy, some are, well, they have different sort of textures and yeah, and feels. Again, here, the 2 pieces on top, although they were very high, the viewer could reach them and slide them around. 2019, so skip a few years, but also to show you a different example of what I've been doing with these pieces of how I learned from them, or how I sort of try to open up the work to new ways of existing or happening. And this is a project in the Dominican Republic, in a space called Sindicato, which is also a nomadic space. It's not a fixed space, and it's run by two artists, Laura Castro and Quisqueya Hernandez. And they invited me to do a project in a coastal town called Las Terrenas. There I was introduced to Damaris, who is this woman who's a seamstress, and to Juan Carlos, who's he's a painter, a street sign painter. Not really street signs. In Spanish, we call it rotulación. It's when they paint, for example, which is like a mural painter. So for a restaurant, he will paint outside, a plate with fish and fries or something like that. Or for a hair salon, he will do a little, scissors and a hair dryer. So I work with both, and I was also introduced to him because some places are very rich in textile history. For example, the project I did at Osmos is it's in the northeast of the States. Quilting is very strong here in the northeast as well as in the south of the States. But for me, there's sort of two sort of parallel histories of quilting and styles. Or Mexico has a super strong tradition of textiles. You have like many different sort of techniques and materials that you can choose to work with. And some places don't have much tradition or none at all. So the Dominican Republic was sort of a challenge in this sense, because I went there also to do like a short research trip, and the fabrics were not very good quality. Everything seemed to be very synthetic, or with patterns already printed. So I worked with what I found, which is just fabric and these bands of color. But while I was working there and researching and traveling in between these, basically Santo Domingo, Las Terrenas, and another town called Sanchez and Las Terrenas are both in the coast. I will see all these houses, like amazingly painted and decorated. And I asked my friend, Laura, like, what's going on here? I said, no, just people like to paint their homes, like to paint their... So besides doing the exhibition, I also did this exercise where I will ask permission to the owner of the house to install temporarily there for like even 10 minutes or half an hour, a curtain, and to produce a dialogue with the curtain and the home. What's interesting for me is that this is also sort of a color and sort of a decorative use of color, but also very, it can be very formal, it can be more organic. It depends on the home too, it depends on the materials, it depends on how it was built. Some are very humble houses. Some are more, like official, like this one. And then I would just find a curtain that I thought will dialogue well with that house. So in this case, all the windows of the house were painted this way. And for me, this is also, it's important as a way also to take the work out of the gallery or the museum or the exhibition space. It's a way to dialogue with the city and with the context where the work is produced or being shown. And then these photos, for this series of photos, I made an artist book, but there's other series of photos, similar projects that I've done, that the work is exhibited as a photo. And what I found kind of surprising and beautiful is that this is sort of it's sort of like a very, like discrete or sort of hidden knowledge. Like, these people, they all paint their homes and they don't, they don't talk about it, or there's no course they go, or there's no, manual. It's just very organic and oral. And I feel there's even like a competition between the different homes. Like they were like, who has the coolest and most fun painting? So I did the show, and the show was in an outdoor space, but when I talk about this project, I prefer to show these pictures with the houses. And this is Juan Carlos, who the painter I was talking about before. He did a few, we did like 3 or 4 that were hand painted. Like, so this is one, that's another one, and that's another. Okay, and now fast forward to 2021, and this is what Christian was mentioning before, that sort of we kind of clicked, and this was a show at the Paris Art Museum. It was supposed to open in 2020, but then it got postponed a year because of the pandemic. And the curator I worked with there, Jennifer Ignacio, she proposed me to, as an idea, to consider working with a Miccosukee artisan. The Miccosukee people are it's a Native American tribe from South Florida. They are kind of brother sister tribe of the Seminole people, so their textile patchwork work is basically the same, or they come from the same tradition. The Seminole stayed more in the north, or sort of central Florida, and the Miccosukee migrated more south, and they basically escaped from, I think it was Oklahoma. There was, it has a name, sorry, I forget it now, but there was a war going on, and they migrated south. And at one point, the Seminole and the Miccosukee split from the Seminole, and they decided to live here in the Everglades, which is this huge, wide river, which they are constantly battling also because of the construction of highways and everything. Basically, the river has been cut and interrupted the natural flow of the water. But they survived here. They were hunters and gatherers. And about 100 years ago, in the 1920s, they were introduced to the sewing machine, and this textile tradition developed of patchworks. The patchworks are basically bands of with different designs, very bold and very and very meticulous. Like each of these bands is maybe 1 inch to 2 inches wide. So imagine the cutting and the folding and the sewing of all those different pieces. And it's very repetitive and very mechanic too. But it's also interesting is that a lot of the designs and the more traditional designs are basically also abstractions of nature. So the one on top here is called Frog. And the bottom one, no, that's just, it's called like diamond something shape. But a bunch of them have names or refer to a natural element or an animal. So there's, for example, man on horse is a pattern, or lightning, or big storm, worm, bird, and so on. So it was interesting for me to also work with this other history of abstraction, of sort of a hidden, displaced history of abstraction. When I was doing my research too, I was invited to a fashion show. You know, like there's a bunch of designers, young designers. It's pretty big. They have like a new sort of young movement of designers that combine traditional patchwork with contemporary design and cloth making. This case, no, this case is more, it's sort of like a traditional medicine man costume, clothes. And I work with Khadija Cypress, who's an artisan, young. She might be now like 30 years old. When I met her, she was 27, something like that, pretty young. And she has this studio, which is sort of a collective studio too. She works on her own, but she also teaches how to do patchwork. She also invites other people to come and work here. There's probably like a membership fee, I don't know, but she has this, so it's sort of like a textile community center. But this is also in the reservation, and it's mostly, it's a Miccosukee center. Like I asked her, for example, if she would like to do a workshop at the Paris Museum, and she told me no, because she doesn't want to teach patchwork to people who are not Miccosukee. You know, they want to keep it within themselves, which is understandable. And this is Khadija. So here also we will go through a process of dialogue or collaboration, like my abstraction and her history of abstraction. And I will send her, for example, copies of the drawings, or scans of the drawings, and then she will pair that drawing with a specific pattern, a specific patchwork. And I also send her the backgrounds of all the, like, I think we did 24 curtains or 25. And so I sent her 25 samples, and then she would choose also the color combinations of the patchwork for a specific background. So that was also a conversation, a dialogue that lasted like a year. And then in the space, you can see they also hang in different ways. There's like 3 or 4 ways of hanging them. One is against the wall, well, like in a fixed position, then against the wall in over a cable situation where people can move them, or also hanging from, it's just a regular twine thread rope. And yeah, and they each one interacts with space and the public in a different way. So when they're on cables, as I mentioned, you can move them, or if they're hanging, they also move gently by themselves. They're kind of constantly spinning with the circulation of air, or if somebody walks by. They're kind of open, or very open to the environment, to these subtle changes of environment. Like this pair too, these two, it's one of my favorite pairs of that show. And the one on the left, the red one, is called Lightning, and the one on the right is called Stone. And that's the detail of the patchwork. We also did a special event for Khadija and her family. Just as a way to, she invited friends and family and members of her community. So, and these are her children playing with the curtains, yeah, messing around. And it was interesting also, it was the first time that the museum exhibited or had in their, in the galleries, anything related to Miccosukee culture. And it's, and they've been there forever, much longer than the museum. But it was the first time that they participated in, in this scale, I think, at the Paris Museum. We also did a series of, there was like 3 or 4 talks, public events where I proposed, because I basically collaborated with Khadija, but also Houston Cypress, who's an artist, poet, and activist, and Dante Blaise-Billy, she's an art historian. And this was like the team that I worked with, and I proposed that they took charge over the public program. So like most of the events, that was at least my intention. Maybe it didn't happen completely, but my intention was that they will organize, and use that space for them to decide what they wanted to talk about, from the Everglades to patchwork tradition to anything they wanted to discuss. We also put some pieces outdoors, because Miami also, it's not a city with a lot of public spaces. So I think this museum is interesting in the sense that the outdoor space is very inviting, and it's used a lot by the public. Sometimes people go there and hang out outside without necessarily going inside the museum. So we thought it was important to have some pieces outside. And then of course, they might get damaged with the rain or with sun, but personally, at least for me, that's not a problem. I mean, even if the color fades with the sun, it's sort of a, it's a testimony of that work was outside there for like a whole year. And then with this, I know I have 2 more projects to show, one in Chile, and the last one is we're going to close with Osmos Upstate, sort of as an introduction for also tomorrow, if you want to come to the show. So this is last year in Chile. It was a exhibition in a museum called MAVI. And it was also part of a prize that mid-career artist prize, which also out of this also came a book that at Osmos, if any of you is interested, on Saturday we're going to do a book launch. And the museum was proposed to me also to collaborate with another foundation which owns this house, and this house functions as sort of a community gallery. It's in the north of Santiago in an area called Recoleta, which is a pretty much working class neighborhood. And the idea of this foundation is to invite artists into residencies and to develop projects with the community. So, and my project already, it was sort of a perfect match, because what I proposed to the museum was to produce the work in a workshop. I've done this also. So the collaboration with the different people, it has like kind of different degrees. Like sometimes it works as a commission. For example, last year I also did a project in Mexico, and I worked with two weaving companies, two weaving studios. And weaving is a very complex and long process. So in that case, I couldn't participate. But so that worked more as a commission. And other times it's a workshop. In other occasions, it's one artisan, for example, Cadilla. Or in the case of Osmos, I also work with one artisan, Danielle, but in this case, she taught me how to quilt, and we worked on the first one together, and then the rest I did by myself. So in this case, in Chile, the workshop in this house, I worked again with Miriam, who's on the right. Miriam is the seamstress and embroiderer that worked with me on the first curtain, the first one that I showed. So we've been also collaborating since then, it's almost like 17 years, because she's done a bunch of projects in between too. When I go to Chile, if I have a show, or if I'm just there and I want to produce something. And I invited her to do this workshop together. And the workshop had two levels of sort of difficulty. A basic level, which we taught the chain stitch, which is one of the most easiest or most simple, and also kind of find it a very beautiful stitch for embroidery, which it's very slow and it's repetitive, but you finally get there, and you can also add another line next to it, and another one, and then you end up with a much thicker line, which is also important so you can see it from afar. So this was like the basic level for people who had no experience or maybe a little bit of experience embroidering. And then there was another more complicated technique called, I forgot the name now, it's a smock. And smock, I also call it like honeycomb. And it's these dresses that it's very traditional in Latin America, in Mexico and in Chile. I think Peru too, that especially like little girl dresses, it has this like wrinkled fabric here. Smocking, yeah. So she taught smoking and how we could apply smoking to the curtains. And her family, her mother, I'm talking about Miriam, her mother, her two sisters, this is like their home run operation. That this is what they've been doing for 40 years. They produce these dresses, and they do all sorts of embroidery and textile projects. So, and this was for people, of course, that had more experience embroidering. And some days it will be 2 people will show up, and some days it was a full crowd like here. Was interesting too is that it was also very diverse in terms of age, of gender, of different parts of the city, different also again cultural backgrounds, economical backgrounds. But what united everybody was the act of getting together and embroider for 2 or 3 hours a day, and it became sort of a interesting space for people. That people met each other. There was friendships maybe, or yeah, it's an interesting like community moment, like the creation of community, because also it wasn't just 1 day or 2, it was for 5 weeks. And as pieces were being completed or finished, we hang up a few in the space, which is also interesting for me, because these experiences also are sort of an opportunity for me to also share the work in a different way. It's not only going to the exhibition, it's producing the work, and it's talking about why or what interests me of abstraction, or how I, how this very traditional techniques, embroidering, can be applied in a different scale, with a different sort of meaning, with a different impact in space. So there's all these conversations that happen while the work is being produced, which for me is important too, because it's another way of sort of sharing the work. And this is how it looked in space. So again, some are against the wall, some are movable. And we had there was a wall text of the exhibition, and then we also had the list of everybody who participated. Like it was like 65 people or something like this. I also placed a poster on the wall, which has a text, which is a text that is sort of a statement of the curtains, which I can send later if you're interested, or it's also in the book that we're going to launch on Saturday. And it's a text that describes the people and places I've worked with since the beginning. So it's also the idea is that it's the text as a weave, sort of like a textile text, a woven text that it can grow with time. Like as the more people or more projects I do, and I don't know if at one point I'm going to stop in 10 years, or maybe I continue till my last breath. But the idea is that it's a text that keeps growing as the work keeps, exploring new places and new techniques and new people. And to end, and thank you for your patience. This is Osmos. So yeah, this is March last year. And this is Danielle. So we did one piece together, and then she helped me with a second one just to like get it started. It was also kind of a learning situation for both of us, because when I made the designs for the curtains, as I said, I always start from a notebook or sheet of paper, and I divide it in a grid, and then I play with different sort of formal combinations within that grid. What I've researched until that point of patchwork is because in the south of the States, and the African American tradition is much more organic, let's say, because they work, their history comes also from a super, comes from poverty. So they will work with scratches of fabric, whatever they find, or maybe a piece of cloth that can't be used anymore, and they will sort of recover pieces of it. So that's why, and that's what I've seen so far, that almost all of the quilts from the south have this sort of organic composition. They don't have this grid structure that the Northeast patchwork has. And in the Northeast, this geometric structure is all based on a square and triangles, which I didn't know when I started making the designs. So I worked based on a rectangle, and when you work on a rectangle, to later patchwork this and to keep the proportions, like it was much more difficult, because a square and a triangle is pretty straightforward. A square you can cut in half, and you have two triangles, and then there's different ways of sewing those pieces together and creating these patterns that kind of repeat, almost endlessly. But with a rectangle proportion, it was very complicated. So with Danielle, we also tried figure out together how to do it. And then the works have a patchwork stage and then an embroidery stage. And the embroidery stage is what joins the three layers together. So all quilts have a back, a filling, and a front. There was one piece hanging outside, which I will take down sometimes if the weather was too hard. And then this is a show and this is Osmos Station 2. There was a studio space and exhibition space afterwards. And this is what we're going to show tomorrow, but of course the space is different. It's smaller, it's lower, so the works also hang in a different way. But also what's interesting for me with quilting is that, yeah, in this case, I learned a new technique, but I also, did it myself. And the work has a very sort of, it has a weight and a thickness that is different from the previous works. It also has this kind of, yeah, it kind of behaves in a different way, like the feeling, the thickness of it. It has these like little waves sometimes, but it's all part of the quilt process. And I'm very sort of happy with the result, because I wanted to make something with quilt, but it also that wasn't quilt. That it is quilt, but at the same time, it's not the typical quilt, or it's not the quilt you see, or you can like immediately think, oh, it's a quilt. It takes a little longer to figure out that it's quilt. I think maybe I'm wrong. So yeah, if anybody has a question, but I think that's basically what I wanted to say.